It's the morning of May 23rd, 2011. I'm Michael Aron of NJN News here for the Center on the American Governor at Rutgers University. We're going to talk about Brendan Byrne this morning for the Brendan Byrne Archive. We're at the Eagleton Institute at Rutgers. We're going to continue an interview we began nearly 5 years ago with John Degnan. John was an assistant counsel, then executive secretary to Governor Byrne in the first term, became attorney general in the second term, and then ran for governor to succeed Brendan Byrne, but did not get the Democratic nomination. We had two interviews in 2006 that took us up through the first term of Brendan Byrne and Degnan's relationship with Byrne over those years. Today we're going to pick it up with the second term. John, we're picking up on a conversation that we left off nearly 5 years ago, and we got through the first term. You're identified with the second term as being Byrne's attorney general. Tell us again how that happened.
Well, shortly after, it may even have been before the November 1977 election, Bill Hyland, who had been attorney general in the first term, let it be known that he didn't intend to stay for the second. So it was a position that, well, we knew had to be filled. In candor, I'm not sure if Brendan Byrne would have kept Bill Hyland on for the second term anyway, but it was really, my recollection, Bill's decision to leave. I approached the governor and told him I'd have a strong interest in the job, and he told me I was too young.
How old were you?
I was 33. And I told him that I thought that the experience I had had in the last year, particularly of the administration, when he was off running and I was holding the office together, had equipped me with more skills at my age than would normally attach to somebody of my age. And he was pretty definitive, though, that he didn't think it would fly. And so I was enormously disappointed, but I understood him.
This was before the election?
This was after the election. I would never have broached this subject with him before the election. It would have been presumptuous, and frankly, I'm too superstitious to take for granted that he was going to win. He, I think, was strongly inclined towards Steve Wiley, or somebody of certainly somebody of that kind of stature. And Steve Wiley, who was a senator from Morris County, who was an incredibly impressive lawyer and very well respected. I understood that. And I had one or two other conversations with him after it. They were gentle, soft conversations in which he'd ask me a question or I'd continue to express my interest. But he pretty much shut me down from his thinking about who he was going to appoint at that time. And I always remember, Michael, I had the office right outside his, and I knew that he had called because the press office told me, and his secretary, Dottie Seltzer, confirmed it, that he had called a press conference for the next day, I think probably in late November, probably December, to announce his selection. So not having been told who it was and not having been encouraged to believe it was going to be me, I waited around that day. I don't think I went to the bathroom all day in the office, so if he walked by, he'd have an opportunity to either let me down gently, which is what I thought was coming, or tell me. So he didn't. He studiously avoided me all day, which convinced me that I wasn't going to get it. I knew it would be hard for him to say no to me, given the relationship we had. I went home that night and said I was back in West Orange, and I said to Mary, "It's not me. I don't know who it's going to be tomorrow, but he hasn't even told me." And I began to think about what I was going to do after that. I didn't want to stay in the job I had with him. I was depleted there. Anyway, I got a call about 10 o'clock that night from the trooper at Morven, who said the governor wanted me to be there in the morning at 8:30, and didn't tell me why. He didn't know. I went down, and I said to Mary, at least he's going to tell me who it is before he announces. He didn't ask that she come down. So I went down there 100% convinced it would be somebody like a Steve Wiley or maybe Alan Handler coming back off the court to do it or something. And I always remember meeting with the governor and Gene Byrne, not in the library where he did most of his business meetings, but in the solarium at Morven, which is where the family hung out. And I always remember the words. Brendan said, "Gene and I would like to ask you to be Attorney General in the second term, for which I've always been grateful to Jean. I think she was the deciding vote.
Do you?
Yeah. And she's a remarkable woman, and I've asked her a couple of times whether she was influential in it, and she's too modest to say she was, but I think she was. So in any event, it came as a surprise.
So you were told at Morven, and it was announced at the State House later that day?
A couple hours later at the State House. I had none of my family there, and there wasn't much ceremony around it. The first question Brendan asked was the question he predicted, which is, what credentials does John Degnan have to be Attorney General? And Brendan gave an answer that I'll also always remember. He said he's a quick learner. But he had just won this incredible election. He had the power to pick somebody who wasn't qualified in the public's mind or in the press mind. I was seen as a Brendan Byrne protege, partisan, devotee, and I was unabashed about it.
Would you have left had he not selected you? You say you were kind of burned out as, executive secretary to the governor?
I don't know whether I would have left. I probably would have. He probably would have found something else to entice me. I did discuss with him becoming prosecutor of Essex County. Don Coburn, I think, was then the prosecutor and was going to be appointed to the bench. The governor told me I wasn't qualified to be prosecutor of Essex County either. That led to a discussion. I actually think he was right. He thought the prosecutorship of Essex County was a more difficult job than being the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey, having had the job himself. I don't know what I would have done. I probably would have left, but I would have left not angry and not ungrateful, but just to go on and do something else in my career.
Were there other big changes in the Byrne team during that transition time? He
liked two people, and he also liked the structure that emerged during the 1977 campaign. In the Minor administration, I don't believe they had a chief of staff. You had powerful people within the office, legislative counsel. This is the Byrne administration now, but I think he took it from what he did in Minor. The executive secretary was a powerful position, but it was a personal position to the governor and more political and administrative in its role, less substantive, to be candid. The chief counsel to the governor was always a preeminent lawyer and somebody who was a very accomplished practitioner. Brendan also had a legislative counsel, Jerry English, who was very adept at dealing with the legislature and a good lawyer. I think we had a director of policy in the latter part of the Byrne first term, but maybe not, because policy was more or less contained in the governor's office on the rationale that I discussed in the last interview. When the governor was campaigning, both in the primary and then in the general election, I functioned as both counsel and executive secretary and was a de facto chief of staff, but never had the title, never even thought about needing it. And I think he liked that structure. Not me necessarily in that structure, but he liked the structure of being able to rely on one if he could find someone he trusted, which for Byrne is not easily given. So I knew there was going to be a chief of staff. He also liked Harold Hodis a lot. Hodis was working for Ken Gibson in Newark, was very active in the campaign. I think he left Gibson to come into the campaign. And Hodis was a really skillful politician. Jerry English was heading off to do DEP, and Hodis would add that political dimension to the office and was an addition to the Byrne circle of people in the office, so was going to be energetic. And Henry Luther was going off to do other things and wasn't coming back into the governor's office after having left the executive secretary position to become the campaign manager. He also liked Bob Mulcahy a lot, who had been running the Department of Corrections, and Bob was both a good politician and a good policy person. So anyway, Bob Mulcahy came in to be chief of staff, and Harold came in whatever his title was, to run the politics of the office, and I went on to be Attorney General. Jerry English to the Department of Environmental Protection. Those were the major changes. There were other changes in the cabinet as well, but they don't leap out at me at the moment.
Did you have any trouble getting confirmed at 33, 34?
No, there was one vote against me. I think Jim Walwork, playing the inimitable gadfly that he was,
Republican senator from Essex
County that I've talked about before. I think it was Walwork and not Cardinale, but it could have been either. Voted against me, but otherwise I was confirmed.
When you think back on your time as Attorney General, what issue or issues dominated your tenure?
Several. One was the whole process of the initial casino licenses, which happened on my watch with respect to Resorts and Bally's and Caesars, which were the first three applicants. The second was a wave of deregulation, which I was personally committed to, and liquor was an obvious one. Bill Hyland and Bob Del Tufo and Ed Steer had done a pretty comprehensive investigation of the retail and wholesale liquor industry. The regulatory system there is a function of the industry persuading regulators after Prohibition ended to adopt and embrace a protectionist attitude toward liquor. I could talk about this for hours, but I won't. But in that 4 years, using my power as the person to whom the Director of Alcoholic Beverage Control reported, we deregulated administratively the industry, overcame the judicial challenges to it by the industry. I argued the case in the Supreme Court. They upheld the regulations, and within that 3-year period, we deregulated the industry. A bottle of J&B Scotch was probably sold for $2 or $2.50 less at the end of my term than it was at the beginning. Unfortunately, not enough people drank Scotch to get me elected governor. But then I went after the milk industry, which also had a protectionist, state-administered system that elevated prices. But I couldn't do that administratively, and my bully pulpit wasn't strong enough to get it done legislatively, but I tried. There was an issue around the state police and the absence of women in the organization, and we approached that by arguing with Clint Pagano over why we couldn't get more women in the state police. Clint always said they couldn't get through the boxing component of the course, and I said, well, who do they box? And he said, well, other recruits. And I said, so women box men? And he said, yes. And I said, Clint, when was the last time do you think a state policeman used boxing techniques to apprehend a perp? He said he couldn't remember. So I said to him one morning, I said, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have an all-female state police recruit class, and they can box each other. And we did. We had the first one in the country, and that class produced something like 35 or so new women state police. There were energy problems in the second term. There was a scandal about oil companies, and there was actually discussion about whether we should nationalize them. 3 Mile Island happened. I think that was in the second term, which elevated a lot of our thinking about preparedness for catastrophes and the like. And then there were the usual everyday crises that seemed to consume a lot of time.
Like what?
Appointments not being made, or battles among cabinet officials, or forfeitures of authority by cabinet people. One of the great things about being Attorney General, if you're close to the governor, is that for political reasons, strong cabinet officers would defer decisions. An example, funding for therapeutic abortions. So that the Commissioner of Human Services, normally in the administration of regulations, would have to decide whether the state should fund that. If the commissioner doesn't want the political cost of deciding one way or the other, such a hot issue, she's going to ask the Attorney General for an opinion on whether she can, which is a forfeiture of her authority, but a delegation to the Attorney General, who's the sole legal advisor to all the agencies of state government. She could not go out and hire her own lawyer to give her that opinion. She had to, by statute, give it to the Attorney General, and by statute, she had to comply with the Attorney General's advice. So, and you could opine in a way that affected public policy. The last thing I would say on that point is, if a cabinet officer believes they're going to lose an argument with the Attorney General because the governor is likely to come down on the Attorney General's side rather than the cabinet officer, they often won't pick the fight, so as not to be embarrassed or diminished. So given my relationship with the governor, I may have been seen by the cabinet as having a preeminent status. Right or wrong, I certainly nurtured the notion and was able to speak on a lot of public policy issues, probably beyond my mandate.
Who were your key staff people at the department?
They were, Ed Steer had been appointed the director of the Division of Criminal Justice by Bill Hyland in December, before I took over. He became a key advisor, an incredibly accomplished and insightful director. And frankly, Michael, he had credibility in law enforcement, not only in New Jersey, but nationally, which I benefited from, since I didn't have it myself. Steve Skillman was the director of the Division of Law. He's now an appellate division judge about to retire. It was a brilliant, skillful government lawyer in the tradition of people like Alan Handler, who had had that job as director of the Division of Law before him. And Steve became a guy on whose legal judgment I relied almost, well, it's not almost, more than any other single lawyer in the office. Paul Levy was the first assistant attorney general. He left after a few months to become a judge. I hired Judy Yaskin, who had been a public defender and a very liberal, very skillful lawyer with enormous integrity. And she was a key person. I had a great director of the Division of Motor Vehicles named Joan Wiskowski, who turned the place around and made it much more consumer-oriented. Adam Levin was director of the Division of Consumer Affairs. He wasn't a key advisor, but he did a very good job there. Those are probably the key. Mickey Fagan and a guy named Jim Nugent were my two special assistants who were very instrumental in a lot of what I did. Jim died actually in a car accident while I was Attorney General, and Mickey finished the term with me. So I think they were the key people.
Does the New Jersey Attorney General have more powers than other state attorney generals? Attorneys General?
Yeah, I think that's true. It's certainly, as we've talked about, it's true of the governor. I think it's also true of the Attorney General for a couple of reasons. One is they're not elected. In 44 of the 50 states when I was Attorney General, the Attorney Generals were elected, and only 6 of them were they not. Secondly, they constitutionally vested with the office. The governor could not remove the Attorney General except for cause through an impeachment process, as he couldn't remove the Secretary of State because the Secretary of State had authority over elections. So a governor knows when he appoints an Attorney General, that's it. He's not getting rid of that person unless he can persuade him to leave or he does something wrong and he can impeach him. So then, thirdly, by statute, as I said before, there's a very unusual statute in New Jersey that says that the sole legal advisor to the state agencies is the Attorney General, and that the cabinet officer must comply with the legal advice given to him by the Attorney General.
I'm wondering whether there's been an example of someone who defied a governor's desire for him to step out as Attorney General.
Yes. Yeah. I think it was the first term, but it may have been the second term. There was a woman who I like a lot, but Pat Sheehan, who was the director of the Division of Consumer Affairs. No, I'm sorry, was the Community Affairs, was cabinet officer head of Community Affairs. The governor wanted Pat to leave, and she refused. The statute that creates that position says that she shall serve until her successor is appointed and confirmed. The Senate refused to confirm the person the governor appointed to be her successor, and they did that in collaboration with her, and she stayed until we could achieve a compromise that induced her to leave.
Arthur Sills, is there some way in which he figures into this discussion?
Well, Sills served as Attorney General under Governor Hughes. I don't recall.
Okay. The casino, that was the first one your memory brought up as one of the issues you dealt with. You said the licensure of resorts and Bally's and Caesars, the first three, as I recall, those were not easy processes. There were a lot of questions about their ties, their honesty, et cetera, et cetera. Is that how you remember it?
Yes. First of all, the climate was this. The governor had made the strongest possible statements about ensuring that the regulatory apparatus around casinos would be pristinely honest, that the kind of people we licensed would be without blemish, certainly without any remote connection to organized crime. And he had a lot vested in that. On the other hand, the people had approved the constitutional amendment on casino gaming because of the economic benefit it would produce for Atlantic City. And there was enormous pressure to begin that process. The casino license would be granted conditioned only upon the building of a hotel. And that was thought to be the impetus to follow-on development that would be a renaissance for Atlantic City. We had a difficult first application in time for Resorts International, which was headed by an individual about whom there were rumors and maybe more than rumors about previous connections to organized crime in connection with casinos that were run outside the U.S., in the Bahamas, I believe, by that entity. And the governor several times said to me, look, John, just get it decided. The best result would be you give them a license. The next best result would be you oppose a license. But just get it decided. So I put a lot of pressure on the people who were doing the investigation to do it expeditiously. But I was never told by the governor one way or the other how to come out on it. Now, remember, the system is such that the Division of Gaming Enforcement reports to the Attorney General. That's the agency that does the investigation and makes a recommendation on licensure. But the actual decision is made by the Casino Control Commission, who do not report to the Attorney General, are appointed by the governor, and the commission was headed by a former prosecutor from Essex County named Joe Lordi. So the Attorney General is, in essence, not the decider, but the litigator before the commission on the licensing question. With respect to resorts, we ultimately concluded that we would oppose the licensure of that entity because of the organized crime connections that had historically existed, and because of our inability to convince ourselves that they were totally devoid of those connections now. The Division of Gaming Enforcement was headed by Bob Martinez, who was the leading draftsperson of the legislation. But we brought in a guy named Mickey Brown, who was the best criminal trial lawyer we had in the Division of Criminal Justice, to try the case before the Casino Control Commission. And we hunkered down for a very high publicity, very contentious litigation before the commission. The outcome of that was to conditionally grant the license. Half a loaf, you might say. The license was granted to Resorts International, conditioned upon their removing a guy named Jim Crosby, who was the CEO, as the CEO or as an owner of the entity. We probably succeeded in making him a very wealthy man because resorts had to buy him out. And that was the compromise of the Casino Control Commission, and the license then was granted with Crosby's being excised, and resorts became the first operating casino.
Joel Stearns from Trenton was the attorney for resorts at the time?
Yes, he was. Joel had been counsel under Governor Hughes and was a very prominent, influential lawyer in Trenton and had been a big Byrne supporter. and I was at one point close to Joel. He wanted to know which way we were going to come down on the recommendation with respect to licensure, but of course I couldn't tell him. But Resorts was a publicly traded company, and if anyone knew what we were going to do, and frankly, we didn't know until a few days before we announced it. But Joel was very effective during the hearings. He brought in a guy named Ed Fitzpatrick and Ray Brown. Ray was probably the best civil criminal trial lawyer in the state at the time, and Ed was an old friend of mine with whom I had practiced law, but also a good trial lawyer. And they were very effective during the hearings.
Did your coming out against Resorts affect your relationship with Joel Stearns?
Yes, I think Attorney General's not quite like being a judge, but I think your relationship with lawyers has to change somewhat when you're Attorney General. You're often taking steps that are adverse to their clients' interests, so it became a more formal relationship rather than personal.
Did he ever forgive you?
I don't know. Joel died about a year ago,
yeah.
and
Less, a few months ago.
Yeah, I don't think he did.
Caesars and Bally's, did you oppose them, or?
We did, on the same rationale, essentially, that we opposed Resorts, which is that they had historical ties to organized crime and they were operating. It was the Perlmans in the case of Caesars, and the O'Donnells. Bill O'Donnell, I think was his name, in the case of Bally. And the results were the same. We opposed. The commission gave us half a loaf by causing the license to be issued conditional upon the removal of the offending people.
In hindsight, you think the position you took on those issues made sense?
Yes.
And the outcomes were good for the state?
The outcomes were disappointing to me. They were a compromise result, and I think they diluted somewhat the promise of the proponents of casino gaming that we would have a system that produced only pristine operators. I think what I was expecting, and I don't know if I speak for the governor on this or not, was that the tremendous profits that could be made from honest casino gaming would attract a whole new group of entrepreneurs into the business, and not the historical folks who would run casinos elsewhere, where the mob was related in one way or another, if not directly to the owners of the casinos, through the union connections and otherwise. What we found, and probably should have realized, was that the initial applicants were going to be the people who knew the casino industry and had experience in it. And those people came with that baggage. Eventually, I think, entrepreneurs did emerge who weren't burdened with past affiliations, who were the kind of people we expected to come to Atlantic City.
Do you think that any mistakes were made back in those days in terms of policy towards Atlantic City that are at the root of the disappointment that prevails in the state today around Atlantic City's inability to turn itself completely around?
Yes.
What mistake was made?
Atlantic City, in many senses of the word, was destitute before casino gaming was instituted. It had no property tax base to speak of. It had a political system that was replete with corruption and ineptness corruption at worst and ineptness at best. And we were putting into that environment an incredibly powerful foreign element who depended on regulations not only at the state level, but also in connection with building and other investments in the town on local approvals. And they were totally underprepared and under-equipped to deal with it. We should have, as a price for putting casinos in effect, created a regional government structure, something like the Hackensack Meadowlands Development Commission, but more intrusive on Atlantic City and the environs around it, and ensured that a competent local government structure would be in place to deal with this infusion of money and influence and political power. And we didn't do that. And I think Atlantic City paid a price for that.
35 years later, the current governor, Chris Christie, has created a tourism and entertainment district to be state-run in Atlantic City. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
I'm not familiar with the specific details of that proposal. I've obviously read about it. I wanted more than that. I would have, with the benefit of hindsight, I wasn't arguing for this at the time, by the way. I wasn't prescient enough to immediately see this. But I would have argued for a more comprehensive governmental structure to take over local zoning board and planning board approvals to use the Blighted Areas Act and the ability of a government structure to declare areas of a town in need of redevelopment, all the panoply of power that government has to influence this. I don't think that Governor Christie's proposal, which is a step in the right direction, goes as far as that.
The second thing that you brought up when I asked about issues was deregulation, and you talked a little bit about the liquor industry. Give me just a little more detail on how a bottle of scotch suddenly sold for $2.50 less. What was it? The Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission? Did you allow more outlets to sell liquor? What did you do?
Let me take a step back and put it in context. Because of the investigations done by the Division of Criminal Justice into the alcoholic beverage industry, a very powerful state senator from Bergen County, Matty Feldman, who was president of the state senate, was indicted and pled guilty to a felony in connection with price fixing within the existing regulatory regime. What that
President of a wholesale liquor company.
He was in the
Feldman
liquor industry.
was in the wholesale liquor industry. The liquor industry was then very stratified, and still is. There's a wholesale liquor industry, and then there's a retail industry. Prices would be set by the wholesalers, and then by law, the retailers had to charge that price. The consumer was the third tier. After Prohibition ended, which was, phenomenal failure in the history of this. That's a great book about Prohibition called Last Call, by the way, which I'm just finishing reading. And the attitude of the country was Prohibition was a failure, but alcohol was still a danger. The social policy that went into the regulation of liquor was that if you kept prices artificially high, you would decrease demand and people would drink less. Rubbish. People were going to drink their liquor whatever it cost. And there still were cheaper versions of liquor that you could buy that weren't the house brands of liquor. The only people who benefited from that theory were the wholesalers and the retailers who made more money. You had to have a state license, both as a wholesaler and a retailer in the business. And retailers were limited to holding no more than 2 licenses per owner. And licenses got very expensive. The way this system worked, believe it or not, and I'm overgeneralizing here, the wholesalers would post their prices at a fixed date. They were then allowed for 30 days, post them publicly. They were then allowed for 30 days to look at each other's prices and to adjust theirs to meet the competition. So a bottle of J&B Scotch by one wholesaler might be $6. If another wholesaler posted it at $4, either one of them could lower or up their prices to meet the competition, and they did. The retailers were then bound by those prices. And the theory was the government wanted them to be high because people would drink less. Over time, all of the literature suggested that underlying theory that demand would depend on price was wrong. Nonetheless, the system continued. The only people who really understood the arcane regulatory system that the Division of Alcoholic Beverage Control devised were the wholesalers and the retailers and the regulators. And nobody messed with it. And they were powerful political presences in the legislature. So because it was an administrative system and not totally contained within legislation, the person who headed the administration of the regulations could change them with public notice and all that. And there was a guy named Joe Lerner at the time who was the director. And we basically, and Joe came out of the industry, by the way. And after getting the governor's blessing, because I would never have done this without his imprimatur, we told Joe he was going to change the regulations. And he said he didn't think he could. And I said, well, I understood that he didn't think he could, and he had a choice. He was either going to change them or the governor was going to replace him as director. I couldn't replace him. The director appointed him, even though he reported to me. Joe changed the regulations, not happily. And all hell broke loose. The legislature was enormously angry because they weren't involved in the process. It would never have gotten through as legislation. There were pickets outside my house in Princeton, hundreds of them with placards.
From the industry?
My kids still have a Dump Degnan bumper sticker that the industry put out. And I was loving it. It put me against an industry that had just been indicted in the public mind and specifically for corruption, and put me on the side of lowering prices for a commodity. But very few of the industry would talk to me as we were devising the alternative regulations. A few smart retailers who knew what this could do for them in terms of allowing entrepreneurship in the owner of liquor stores did talk to us. And they were usually represented by savvy lawyers. And they helped us shape a regulatory system that benefited the entrepreneurial retailer and certainly benefited the consumer.
You alluded to Joe Lordi. There was a lot of controversy around him during that second term at some point. Can you recall the circumstances of that?
It actually started in the year before the second term, when the governor appointed him as chairman of the Casino Control Commission. There was a state police four-way report, which was what you call the report that the state police did on nominees for public office, and they were always confidential and only read by 2 or 3 people: the governor's appointments secretary, the governor if he wanted to, the attorney general, and I didn't even read them all. The one about Joe Lordi, fairly or not, and he used to say, with tremendous conviction himself, just because I grew up in the city of Newark and there were mobsters around me doesn't mean I was a mobster. And again, fairly or not, Joe was tarred in the report, I think it's fair to say, with connections. Not that he was ever involved in organized crime or ever did anything dishonest, but that he was close to people who were involved in organized crime. I think that's why I would characterize it. That leaked during the 1977 campaign and got headlines. I thought it could impact the outcome of the election because Governor Byrne had been so strong on appointing people who would monitor the Casino Control Commission who were impeccable in their credentials, that the contents of that report would be embarrassing to him and undermine his promise. What happened in reality during the campaign was the Italian-American community in New Jersey rallied around Joe, understandably, and pointed out that these were rumors, never proven. Lordi had never had the opportunity to rebut them in any objective form. And it probably worked to the governor's benefit that the Bateman campaign had leaked, which I am convinced it was the Bateman campaign that had leaked it. Well, then during the second term, something called ABSCAM broke. ABSCAM involved a many-month, if not many-year investigation by the FBI into public corruption. They dressed FBI agents up as if they were Middle Eastern sheiks, meeting with public officials in New Jersey, offering them money for support for casino licenses. Too many New Jersey politicians fell prey to that. A state U.S. Senator, Pete Williams, great Congressman Thompson from Trenton, Mayor of Camden, And I think many more people were approached, but didn't fall into the trap. They had video cameras. I mean, this was a major scandal. Joe Lordi was never implicated in that personally, but it resurrected the old stories about Lordi and whether the Casino Control Commission was as strong as it should have been in regulating the industry. And there was a lot of pressure on the governor to reform the Casino Control Commission, which had only been in place for about a year. And Joe suffered from that again, fairly or unfairly. The old issue got resurfaced in another context. Ultimately, I believe the outcome was that Joe left the commission and went on to do other things, and the governor reappointed the Casino Control Commission. There was one Casino Control Commissioner who resigned, I think, because his name had somehow come up in one of the investigations.
McDonald?
Yes, yeah.
And did Joel Jacobson get appointed to succeed Lordi? Is that what I remember? I may be wrong about that.
I don't remember that.
All right.
No, I think what you may be remembering is Joel became the first commissioner of energy when he had been heading the PUC, and he moved up to the energy position.
All right. After Abscam, did New Jersey overregulate casinos?
I don't believe so. I don't think you can overregulate casinos.
No?
No. I think we watered it down substantially in the last 10 years or so, but I think that's regrettable.
There have been a lot of changes in casino law over the past, and casino regulation over the past 20, 30 years. You didn't let them stay open all night, for example, when they first started. Now they're open all night, and there's been a fair amount of loosening of regulations there. You just said you don't think you can overregulate a casino. Do you disagree with all the reforms of the past 30, 35 years?
I wouldn't call them reforms, and I can't say that I disagree with all of the changes in casino regulation, but I disagree with many of them. You have to realize what you're regulating here, which is essentially an industry that that survives based on its ability to convince people to part with their money through gambling. The whole nature of the industry was to get people to lower their inhibitions and to overcome rational impulses, which would normally restrain them from overspending on gambling. So we didn't want casinos to be open 24 hours. We wanted casinos with windows that didn't issue free drinks. Those were all the devices that casinos in Nevada used to lower people's inhibitions. They wouldn't know what time it was because they were in cavern-like, lightless environments. They were given free drinks, which, frankly, lower people's inhibitions. So we wanted the revenues from gaming, and we knew that people were going to gamble anyway through numbers or other techniques that were out there illegally. So the genius of the proposal was we would license casinos and let people gamble, which they were going to do anyway, but ensure that it was done honestly and that it was done in a way that didn't encourage them to over-gamble, because gambling can be an addiction. And the regulations were designed to achieve all of that, to achieve the honesty of the games and to create an environment in which people would gamble rationally rather than wantonly. We wanted casinos to be successful because we wanted to leverage their financial success into further investments in infrastructure in the city to attract people to come there. A lot of people predicted at the time that debate was going on that over time the political influence of casinos would overwhelm the state. We talked earlier about how it would overwhelm the local government officials. So there were tremendous prohibitions, very onerous ones, on giving political contributions to anybody who ran for state office by a casino or by anybody who was an officer of a casino. That was an incredibly intrusive regulatory scheme. Some people argued it was unconstitutional because it prohibited political contributions. But generally it was affirmed. There were incredibly strong barriers against people leaving government and going into casino positions, which were watered down over time as well. Well, over time, what some people predicted would happen, I think has happened, and that the casinos have significant political power in the legislature, and that they've convinced legislators that they need less onerous regulation so that they can make more profits, and that those profits will be deployed for infrastructure in Atlantic City.
Was it a mistake
It's a slippery slope.
Was it a mistake to force casinos to include restaurants and retail shops within their hotels? In terms of the city's overall development.
No, I don't think it was. I mean, I haven't thought about that question deeply, but it seemed to me what we were trying to create was an environment in which there would be non-direct casino-related jobs created, and that first-class hotels would be built, which would attract a clientele toward casinos that was expanded beyond New Jersey. To do that, you needed a full-service, high-end resort atmosphere, and I think that was all part of this economic strategy.
I want to get us to your campaign for governor, but I want to, in fairness to your, how long were you Attorney General? 3 years?
About 3.5 years. I left in March of 1981. And it started in January of 1978.
In the area of the criminal code, the parole act, the corrections department, the state police, the hazardous waste strike force or task force, the state police involvement in Trenton, what some of the things that were highlighted at the end of Burns' term that fell under the aegis of criminal justice, what stands out?
A couple of things. I think the state police are an interesting organization. I remember when I became Attorney General, Bill Hyland, who was leaving office, said to me, you know, John, you can spend 4 years fighting with the state police, or you can try to work with them. And he said, let me give you an example. I don't know today how many cars they have. For 4 years, I've been trying to figure out how many cars they have. He said, you can spend your time trying to learn that, or you can say that's not the most important issue and you ought to deal with ones that are. So I developed and already had a close relationship with a guy named Clint Pagano, who was the superintendent of state police. State police in New Jersey had a really interesting history of the way they interacted with the governor and the governor's office. There were lots of people who suspected that the state police leaked confidential information, much like J. Edgar Hoover did with the FBI, to influence governors and compel them to either support a budget or otherwise do
You think that was true?
Yes. Under prior administrations of the state police, I think it was absolutely true. I think Clint Pagano was a reformer in that regard. He's a very shrewd politician, but he was also an honest guy. In any event, I developed and cultivated that relationship with Pagano because there were things I wanted to do in the state police. One was to create more diversity in the organization. The second was the governor and I had chatted about, I can't remember when it started, the failure of local police organizations in inner cities to break the cycle of poverty and violence. How do you do that? More people present in a city create density and a feeling of security. Those people aren't going to go there if they think they're in danger. There are other ways you can break the cycle. Maybe education is a way, but we thought that if we could create climates in some of the cities in New Jersey that were safe, that it would induce both individuals and businesses to locate there. Using the state police, though, which is essentially a state organization, to provide police services in a local context was pretty revolutionary in New Jersey for two reasons. One is local home rule embraced the notion that police officers are better controlled by local officials. And the second was an historical one. The state police were generally thought of as a more rural organization. They patrolled directly some small municipalities and townships in the state that didn't have their own state police organization. They recruited heavily, because they were not a diverse organization, from a community of people who were not reflective of the population in cities. They were much more white than our cities were. And they were distrusted by urban police experts, I think, as a force that could be effective in an urban environment. But we did put them into Trenton, and with mixed results, I think. It created a real political backlash. I think it did improve policing in the city for a while. It was the same kind of rationale that led the state to take over educational school districts in Newark and Camden and other places. And it has the same problems. Can you really administer local needs through a state apparatus? State police didn't want to do this, by the way. They were an incredibly proud organization, didn't want to be asked to do things they knew they might not be able to do well. So it took a lot of convincing of them to
By whom?
By me, and by the governor ultimately, because they knew. Again, the superintendent of police is appointed by the governor. He reports to the attorney general, but I would never have done this if I didn't have the governor's total blessing in doing it, because I would never survive a situation in which the state police appealed me to the governor and he supported them. How could I ever bring them to under my authority again? Those stood out. The hullabaloo around the hazardous waste task force was a tense environment. There always was competition between the Division of Criminal Justice in the Attorney General's office, who was appointed by the Attorney General and had its own investigatory personnel, with the state police. All law enforcement organizations are by their nature competitive, and there was huge competition between these two organizations. The Hazardous Waste Task Force was funded by the federal government and consisted of people both from the Division of Criminal Justice and the state police, but there was a lot of distrust within the task force by the state police of the Division of Criminal Justice, and that erupted publicly a couple of times and needed to be brought into balance. There was a congressional investigation that looked into it by, I think, Sam Nunn and John Dingell was involved in it, both very well-respected senator and congressman. I think Al Gore was the subcommittee chairman who hosted some hearings in Washington, and that took a lot of time and management. And it has taken that of every attorney general I've talked to since I left.
Dealing with
the competition
between those two agencies?
And the state police, yes.
And yet they're supposed to work hand in glove, the state police investigating and the division prosecuting.
Right. The problem is that to prosecute effectively, you have to have an investigation that passes constitutional muster and that effectively arms the trial lawyer to win the case. And therein lies the rub. In ensuring that happens, how much influence should the lawyers in the Division of Criminal Justice have over the investigators in the state police to control their investigations so as to make it useful for prosecutorial purposes? It's a question that doesn't have a clear answer. There needs to be, both personally and officially, a good working relationship between the two, and there hasn't always been.
You spoke about the Pinelands to some degree in your prior interviews, but since it is generally considered the legacy item of the second term, if not of the entire Byrne years, what was your role in Governor Byrne's executive order stopping development in the Pinelands?
He was passionate, the governor, about the Pinelands. John McPhee was a personal friend. He was moved when he read the Pine Barrens. I remember him calling the governor, his senior staff, Walter Morvan, and he had John McPhee in the room, and he announced to us that this was going to be a central theme of the second term, and enlisted all of us in support of that notion. I embraced it enthusiastically. I didn't know much about the Pine Barrens. I didn't know much about that part of the state. And I read the book immediately, and while I didn't become as passionate as the governor did about it, that was simply because I knew I didn't need to. I mean, he was already there. I needed to execute, not necessarily convince myself it was right. But I did. I mean, I was totally aligned with the governor's objectives there. I thought the executive order was too broad and probably would not be sustained constitutionally. It imposed land use controls on about 25% of the state with absolutely no legislative authority. It was, in my judgment, overreaching. I never wrote a legal opinion to that effect because I didn't want to put the governor, he didn't ask me for one, and I didn't want to put him in the position of acting in a way that was in defiance of a legal opinion, so I never commissioned one. I talked about it in my office a lot, and I think there was a consensus among us that this was an executive order that might not be sustained. The governor had some other people telling him. I think his then counsel may have been Dan O'Hearn, and Dan thought it had a chance. So in any event, it passed, and the governor asked me to defend it personally in the Supreme Court. Having been 33, my first Supreme Court argument ever in New Jersey was as Attorney General. It wasn't the Pine Barrens issue. It was another issue. But I did, and I argued the case before the Supreme Court. And I think I've alluded to the fact that having expected my head to be handed to me, I was stunned by the friendly reception I was getting among Supreme Court justices by the nature of their questions. The legislative observers in the courtroom went over to tell the legislature that, contrary to all expectations, it looked like this court might sustain the executive order. And confronted with that, they passed a legislation which got probably 80% of what the governor wanted in his executive order into law. He signed it. The Supreme Court declared the case moot and never decided it. And so the governor's strategy, which often, because he's smarter than I am, played itself out to me over time. In retrospect, he didn't know whether the executive order would be sustained or not. He may, because he's so smart, have agreed with the folks like me who were saying it probably wouldn't be. But he also probably knew what the reaction would be, which is in order to get rid of an overreaching executive order that would pass legislation that got him most of what he wanted. It was a very strategic, powerful use of executive orders to get good public policy implemented.
Was it the major accomplishment of the second term?
I don't think so. I mean, it's one of the top 5, I would say.
What are the others?
Well, I knew you were going to ask that. I'm not sure I could list. Well, certainly casinos were a hallmark accomplishment of that administration. He supported a constitutional amendment. He got it passed, and then it was implemented in a way that, while it wasn't all of what I wanted, it did, in many people's minds, and I think in his, achieve a balanced approach to it. Clearly, if you take the 2 terms into context and look for the top accomplishment, the income tax was the paramount accomplishment. People sacrificed careers. He almost sacrificed his reelection over the income tax. He got something done that 2 prior governors had urged be done and weren't able to accomplish. And he did it at huge personal, sacrificial commitment. The Meadowlands was a hallmark Byrne accomplishment that was, nobody remembers. They were in the doldrums, probably going to fail when he became governor in 1974. And the 5th, I would say, was the overall excellence of government during his 2 terms. He attracted nationally renowned experts in environmental protection and higher education and education. Good people come to work for a governor in large part because they are excited by his vision and they trust his integrity. And Governor Burns' ability to put those kind of people together. New Jersey was a thought leader in state governments in the nation. We were doing things that other states emulated later. It was cutting-edge public policy. And that context, I think, of the Byrne administration, while he talks about it often, not in as grandiose terms as I just laid out, I think was the hallmark Byrne accomplishment. He created a government that was honest and public policy oriented, that used politics because you have to use politics to get things done, but wasn't political for the sake of being political.
At what point during your service as Attorney General did you start thinking about running for governor to succeed Brendan Byrne?
Probably in 1978 when I was appointed. I remember the governor coming back from, the governor and Harold Otis and Nancy Byrne and I went on a tour of casinos in London. And then we went to Ireland on the way back. And because of who he was, we were invited to the American ambassador's house in Phoenix Park in London, which in the U.S. ambassador to Ireland was the only non-Irish citizen who could live in Phoenix Park. I think the prime minister, the president's home was in Phoenix Park. But in any event, long story short, at the Christmas party that year, it was probably 1978, the governor said that, and he wanted to be, by the way, Brendan wanted to be appointed by Governor Carter as the Irish ambassador from the U.S. And I remember Don Lincoln was probably there. The governor stood up and he said, I noticed when Degnan and I visited the U.S. ambassador's house in Phoenix Park that he was looking, I noticed when we visited that house that I was looking at the furniture there the same way Degnan looks at the furniture at Morgan. And he made a joke about that, but it's why a politician wants to be mentioned at the Legislative Correspondence Club dinner. He was kind of saying that it wouldn't be preposterous for Degnan to be thinking about running. There were other people close to the governor who wanted to run too. Bob Mulcahy, several cabinet officers, Don Land, Joe Merlino. But in any event, I thought about it, but not very actively. I was 33 years old. I just loved being Attorney General, and I wasn't going to dilute my ability to get things done for those 3 years by thinking too heavily and influencing letting decisions be influenced by whether they'd be good for me politically. And I didn't, and I think in large part is why I didn't get elected governor. I had a lot of enemies when I ran. One thing I learned through my polling was that not everybody who loved Brendan Byrne loved John Degnan, but everybody who hated Brendan Byrne hated me. So I thought about it, but not actively, and I didn't plan. I didn't have a kitchen cabinet of people, and I didn't think through strategically how I could position myself best. I did believe, wrongly, that in late 1980 and early 1981, when I had to make the decision, that I had a shot. The governor did not encourage me to run. He openly questioned whether I could win. He did not promise to endorse me. He did say that if I wanted to run, I should, but I should resign as Attorney General because he didn't think I could run as Attorney General. He couldn't have made me resign, but I believed he was right. And
so when did you resign?
In March of 1981. Now, much to my chagrin, Don Land, who was Secretary of State, was also running against me in the primary state as Secretary of State. And I'd show up at campaign events in my campaign car, and Don would show up with his state driver. And I did complain to the governor about that a couple of times, but the governor couldn't make him resign. And he wasn't loyal enough to abide by the governor's request that he resign.
So you resigned in March. The primary was in June, so you had 3 months on the campaign trail.
Yes.
You had a bunch of rivals for the nomination. I think it was a crowded primary. 7 of you, maybe?
More than that. There were, if I
or
may
11
have these
of
numbers
you?
wrong, I think there were 11 Democrats.
And 7 Republicans.
There may have been 10 Republicans. I mean, it was more than 20 people in the aggregate. And So it became very hard to distinguish yourself as a candidate under those circumstances. The polling suggested that people cared deeply about corruption and crime. And so I stressed during my campaign, although it was by no means unidimensional, I still have my book of policy papers that I put out during the campaign, and frankly am impressed by the quality of the folks I had around me writing these papers. But I ran principally as a crime and corruption fighter. Sounds a little lofty and pretentious. I convinced a lot of the political establishment, certainly myself, and a lot of the press that I had a shot at winning. I certainly believed it passionately. And I ran as hard as I could. It was a family activity, and my entire family, including mostly my wife, who had her own schedule, and she would go things I didn't want to go to. Ran as hard as we could, and we put on as good a campaign as we could, but we had a problem. I was running as which I am, a moderate to left Democrat. There were several of us who had a shot at it running on that side of the spectrum. Joe Molino, Bill Hamilton, Bob Rowe, Kenny Gibson. Jim Florio was in the race, running as a moderate to right candidate. He'd deny that today, probably, but he was. On issues like gun control and abortion, he had a position that was considerably to the right of the position he took when he was governor later, many years later. And so the moderate to liberals divided up the vote. The single South Jersey candidate with a moderate to right agenda won the primary. I think it hurt him in the general election, but that was the outcome.
Did you finish fourth? Or
Fifth.
Fifth.
Pains me to say it, but I was fifth. Not far off from fourth, but fifth.
Did you have any counties? Did you have a county strategy?
You know, here's my read of the election, but it's very self-centered. I won every impressive town in New Jersey, where there was high education levels, where there were people interested in public policy. I tended to win. I did very well in Essex County, which, although I was living in Princeton, was my home county. I beat Pat Dodd in West Orange. Pat Dodd was the senator from Orange in West Orange. He owned a prominent bar there, and he'd been in the legislature for a long time. So I'm proud of the race I ran. I'm proud of the towns I won. But it was just too big a field. We hoped when I did, and the people who were supporting me, that other people would get out of the election as it became clear they couldn't win. An interesting vignette was that Pete Williams had been, I believe, either indicted or it was clear that the United States Senate was going to throw him out of his seat, and because of abscam. If he had left while Brendan Byrne was governor, the governor could have put somebody like Jim Florio temporarily into the U.S. Senate seat pending the next election. And if that could have been done, and if Jim, having gotten out of the race, would have on his own decided to support me, I could have won. If Bill Hamilton had gotten out of the race, or Ken Gibson and endorsed me, I think I could have won. And we tried hard to get that done.
You spoke to both men?
I believe I spoke to the mayor. I don't think I spoke personally to Bill Hamilton, but I certainly had people speak to him. And I spoke to Jim Florio.
Did Brendan Byrne ever say why he thought you couldn't win? You said he said that he didn't think you could win.
Yeah, I'd never run for public office before. He wasn't sure what kind of candidate I'd be. He also said something which proved to be very true. He put it in the context of Bill Bradley, who had been elected U.S. Senator the year before. And, he said, John, you've been treated for 3.5 years as Attorney General. And before that, you were my counsel or executive secretary, and you were treated reasonably well by people because of that. It's going to be different when you're a candidate. You're not going to be an Attorney General. You're just going to be another candidate. And, are you up for that? Can you make the transition quickly enough? He knew, I think, more than I did, my passion for government is public policy. Politics is the price you have to pay to get there. I'm not a particularly good politician. And I think he probably saw that more clearly than I did, given my ego at the time. So I think all of those things were true. I think, frankly, he enjoyed having me as Attorney General. He didn't want me to leave that job either. He still had things he wanted to do that year. So I've never really asked him that question, but that would be my guess as to why. He ultimately did endorse me in an act that was bred by loyalty.
Was it
probably
something you had pressed for?
It's probably against his own best interest. Yeah, I got polling results. My polling results showed that I was making headway consistently from the beginning of the campaign on. Small, marginal, few points at a time. But I think it was sometime in May, early May, I got a poll that was disappointing. I'd stopped moving. Florio had picked up the momentum. I actually went negative against Florio in a campaign ad on the basis of that. I thought Jim was getting away with a lack of clarity on his positions, and that the left was not realizing how right he had gone. It was my own view. But the pollsters said to me, "There's one way you can win this you can win the primary. It will probably cost you the general election, and that is to get Brendan Byrne to endorse you. There's a lack of clarity about who he's really for here." And as I said, not all the people who loved Brendan Byrne were loving me in the polls. So the strategy was that an endorsement by Byrne could just get me over the top in the primary. But because Byrne was a controversial governor at the time and not particularly loved as he is now, it would hurt me in the general election. So I did what any candidate would do and said, "What the hell with the general election? I'll worry about that later. Let me get the primary." And I contacted the governor by phone, and I told him. And I sent David Garth to see him. Nobody sent David Garth. David Garth was willing to go see him to tell him this. Now, Garth had been his campaign advertising manager and guru during both the 73 and the 77 elections, and he had a tremendous relationship with Byrne. And Garth went and explained exactly to him. I didn't want to do this under false pretenses. The governor had an intermediary call me and ask me to withdraw the request. He didn't really want to do this and didn't think it would be good for me. I wasn't going to let him off the hook that way. I said, "Look, if he doesn't want to do it, I'll understand. Just tell him to tell me. Don't deliver the message." And ultimately he did it. He's never said this to me, but I think he knew it wasn't going to make the difference. But in the end, he was maybe paying me back for my loyalty. When he did it, he made enemies of a couple of important people in his life, other candidates, and I think that pained him, and probably he did pay a price for that.
John, backtracking just a little bit, another reform that you implemented as Attorney General was to open up the bond legal business for New Jersey firms. Talk a little bit about that.
This was an initiative I was encouraged to look at by the governor, I think, for the right reasons. Lots of agencies and instrumentalities at the state level where we could have an influence were issuing bonds to raise capital revenue. Whenever you did that, there were just a handful of New York firms, Mudge Rose and Hawkins Delafield being the two most prominent, who made significant amounts of legal fees by representing either the agency issuing the bond or the underwriter, that is, in New York, or the agency in New Jersey that was floating the bonds. And they always made the argument that the legal expertise required to do that was so specialized that only firms that had long-standing reputations and a significant quantity of that business could do it. And I think for a long time that convinced people. The governor said, "Well, I'm not convinced that that's the case. Why don't you look at it?" And we looked at it, and frankly, there was no mystery and you need to understand corporate law and a lot of financial transaction and the law around that. But we decided to open it to New Jersey firms and essentially solicited proposals from a dozen or so of the larger New Jersey firms as to whether they'd have an interest in doing the bond counsel work and at what rate. It was kind of an early antecedent to the public bidding of work. And we ultimately published a list of, I think, about 6 firms that would be qualified according to the state to represent the issuing agencies. And it created a lot of publicity because of the resentment of the New York firms and also the resentment of New Jersey firms who didn't get on the list. But I think it was and it's taken hold. And I'm not aware of a single, in the 30 years or so since, legal malpractice action against any of the firms that we approved or were later approved. We later approved additional firms for inadequate legal services rendered during those transactions. And to be honest, it gave us the opportunity to get some New Jersey firms some additional business, which is always a smart thing to do politically.
Just a note for the transcriptions. I'm Don Linke, and Michael Aron has left.
I've exhausted Michael Aron, and Don's trying to wind this up.
Second team. After losing the gubernatorial election, run us briefly through what you wanted to do next in your remaining career.
I guess, one thing I learned as Attorney General is I liked managing lawyers better than being a lawyer. I thought about becoming a general counsel of maybe a regulated industry that wasn't a casino, and looked around a little bit at that. But there were 2 or 3 law firms that I liked and admired. The old firm I had been with, Clapp and Eisenberg, was one, and then Shanley and Fisher is a place where I had a lot of friends, and I looked also at the Lowenstein firm, and I had discussions with the 3 of them. I needed to make a living. I had no resources when I became Attorney General, and I had very few resources when I left being Attorney General, and I thought about running for Congress. I had won the Northeast Bergen County Congressional District that Cappy Hollenbeck was in, or I'd lost it by 200 votes, just Bob Rowe maybe. The election was going to be the next year, and it looked like Hollenbeck either wouldn't run or could be beat. And I thought seriously about doing that. If I had finished second in the gubernatorial race, I might have done that. But I finished 5th. I had 3 kids. And talking it through with my family, mostly my wife, we decided we didn't want to have a lifestyle that had me going to Washington during weekdays and trying to live in a rented room and coming home on weekends. And it was time to earn a living and do what my father had always said, which is do politics early when you don't need the money, or later in your life when you don't need the money again, because you shouldn't depend on politics as a way to make a living. So I decided to practice law for a while. About 8 years later, an opportunity came to go to Chubb, which is a international insurance company located in Warren, New Jersey, first as general counsel, but with the prospect of becoming a member of management. And I did that in 1990 after 8 years at Shanley and Fisher, and retired in December of 2010 after 20 years there.
John, in your different roles with the state and as a lawyer and as a senior executive with a major Fortune 500 company, which did you enjoy the most?
I'll never have a job that I enjoyed as much as being Attorney General. It's in part because of the kind of governor that we had while I was Attorney General, and his interest in doing the right thing and allowing me to do the right thing. But the ability to impact public policy and issues that had an impact every day on people's lives, more so in my mind perhaps than in theirs, was a gift. And it was exciting and fulfilling. It allowed me to assemble some really talented people to work with, and to be responsive to what I thought were the important issues in the state. I loved my 20 years at Chubb. I respect and admire the company. I wouldn't trade them for anything, but being Attorney General was the highlight of my career. I peaked early.
Why don't you just describe what the family's up to now and any future plans and what you're doing?
My family?
Yeah.
I have 3 children. The oldest, Philip, has just become the executive director of the State Commission on Investigation, which is a legendary and respected entity in the state. My daughter is a mom, has a master's degree in physical therapy and still practices in Manhattan. And my third daughter is about to get a PhD in English with a minor in gender studies. And I tell her all the time about the state police female recruit class. Gives me bona fides. My wife and I are still married. We've been married 42 years, and we're enjoying retirement.
And how many contacts do you have now with Brendan Byrne?
As many as he'll tolerate. This is a man who, aside from my admiration for what he did as a public official, was enormously influential in my career, and I owe him more than I could ever repay him for that. And so I stay in touch with him and do as much as I can with him and for him.